A single empire in Europe would come to control a quarter of the earth and its population. But before becoming the massive British Empire that ruled over oceans and continents, its story began in muddy fields, in wooden villages trembling under the raids of the Vikings. It was in medieval England, still fragmented, that a king named Alfred the Great stood firm against looming destruction. What seemed like just another struggle for survival would turn into the first step toward the unification of England. And little by little, through bloody wars, unexpected alliances, and foreign invasions, the foundation was laid for a kingdom that centuries later would face armies, seas, and rival empires until it became the global power that reshaped the destiny of the world.
When people talk about the Vikings, many imagine only savage warriors raiding villages by the sea. But the true story is much more complex and surprising. These Norse seafarers not only devastated fragile kingdoms of medieval England, but also forced leaders like Alfred the Great to create unprecedented strategies of defense and unification. From this brutal clash between invaders and local peoples was born the foundation of one of the greatest kingdoms in history. The unification of England, the endless wars against neighbors, the religious reforms, the rise of the Anglican Church, the power of kings such as Henry VIII, and the peak under Elizabeth I show how England's trajectory was shaped by blood, faith, and ambition. From the defeat of the Spanish Armada to the colonization of America with Jamestown and the Mayflower, from the Puritans to the East India Company, and from the colonization of the Caribbean to the British colonial expansion, each chapter reveals that the Vikings were only the beginning of a saga that would change the world forever. The 9th century was a time when medieval England was nothing more than small, isolated kingdoms, each struggling to survive the constant Viking invasions. Among them, Alfred the Great stood out as a leader who not only fought the attacks, but also reorganized his land to resist chaos. He built networks of fortifications, strengthened the navy, and sought alliances among nobles, creating a solid foundation that would later allow the unification of England. At this point, no one spoke of a British Empire, but one could already see the beginnings of an organized resistance against external forces. The struggle against the Vikings was brutal, marked by bloody battles in open fields and prolonged seizures of fortified villages. Alfred the Great understood that it was not enough to merely react. The kingdom needed preparation to resist in the long term. He divided the army into shifts, ensuring that there were always men available to fight while others worked the land. This strategy allowed them to face the enemy without completely exhausting the population. Medieval England, once fragile before the Northern Sea, was beginning to create a system that gave more cohesion and stability. Over time, Alfred's kingdom became a point of reference for the other regions of the island. His vision of the future inspired other rulers and made the idea of the unification of England no longer seem like a distant dream. The Vikings, though still a constant threat, no longer found the land completely defenseless. What had once been divided kingdoms was now beginning to gather around the firmest center of power. Slowly, an England capable of dreaming of more than mere survival was being born. After Alfred's death, the legacy of his efforts was not lost. It was his grandson, Athelstan, who managed to consolidate much of the land under a single crown. Recognized as the first king of all England, Athelstan defeated coalitions of Scots, Welsh, and even Vikings, showing that unification was not just an idea, but a reality and progress. This advance marked a turning point. Medieval England was ceasing to be a mosaic of territories and was becoming a unified kingdom. At the same time that he consolidated internal dominance, Athelstan looked beyond the island. His campaigns reached Ireland and Wales, beginning a policy of expansion that, centuries later, would serve as the foundation for the British Empire. Although these incursions were still small compared to what was to come, they revealed an ambition that went beyond mere survival. England,
once vulnerable, was beginning to look beyond its borders. The unification process, however, was not peaceful. Local rebellions, fragile alliances, and the constant danger of the Vikings kept the kingdom on high alert. Castles were razed, trade routes protected, and armies gathered at every new threat. This constant tension shaped the culture and politics at the time, forging an identity marked by the need for defense and the pursuit of stability. Medieval England, still far from the splendor of the British Empire, was being strengthened in the fire of war. With the foundations laid by Alfred the Great and consolidated by Athelstan, England was transforming into something new, a unified land, ready to face increasingly greater challenges. This unification not only guaranteed survival against the Vikings, but also opened the path to future clashes with external powers, which would soon test the strength of his rising kingdom. And it was precisely at this point that new wars would shake the next chapters of English history.
After the initial unification of England, new threats arose to test the strength of this emerging kingdom. Between the 14th and 15th centuries, two massive conflicts would shape its destiny: the 100 Years' War against France and the Wars of the Roses within its own territory. The 100 Years' War began as a dynastic dispute, but soon turned into a series of bloody battles that dragged entire generations into the fields of war. During this period, medieval England was no longer just a land resisting the Vikings. It now confronted neighboring empires and sought to expand its influence on the European continent. The first clashes of the 100 Years' War gave England remarkable victories. Battles like Crecy and Poitiers showed the world the effectiveness of English longbowmen, whose arrows devastated heavy cavalry. These confrontations marked England's entry into the European stage as an organized and innovative military force. However, each victory carried the burden of prolonging the conflict, draining resources, and keeping the population under constant pressure. The glow of conquest soon began to mix with the shadow of exhaustion. Throughout the 15th century, legendary figures arose. Among them, Joan of Arc became a symbol of French resistance, inspiring armies and changing the course of the war. For England, this was a devastating blow. What had seemed like a campaign of dominance turned into attrition, and the lands conquered on the continent began to slip away. The dream of an England ruling over France slowly dissolved, leaving the kingdom indebted and politically unstable. What began as a promise of glory ended in fragility. And it was precisely in this vacuum of power and uncertainty that the Wars of the Roses were born. Two noble houses, York and Lancaster, claimed the English throne, plunging the kingdom into decades of civil strife. Castles were besieged, towns ravaged, and nobles betrayed in a struggle that seemed endless. The people, already weary from the long years of the 100 Years' War, now watched their own leaders destroy one another. Medieval England, once unified under Alfred and Athelstan, now found itself divided again, this time from within. The battles of the Wars of the Roses were marked by betrayals, unstable alliances, and sudden changes of power. Kings were deposed and restored within months, creating an atmosphere of complete uncertainty. This period showed that, even unified, England had not yet achieved lasting stability. Internal struggle eroded its strength, delaying any attempt at expansion beyond the islands. It was a time when the idea of greatness seemed distant, while the red and white roses symbolized the blood spilt at the kingdom's heart. Despite the chaos, this civil conflict eventually prepared the way for a new dynasty, the Tudors. With the victory of Henry VII in the year 1485, the rival houses were finally united, and England found in him a new beginning. The English crown, though weakened by centuries of war, now had a foundation to reorganize the country. This dynastic shift not only represented the end of internal strife, but also the start of a new phase that would connect the kingdom to the great transformations of Europe. From the Tudors onward, England would move toward religious reforms.
disputes with continental powers, and the opening of maritime routes that would lead it to build an empire. But before that, it still had to deal with the legacy of prolonged wars, broken alliances, and a population yearning for stability. And it was precisely in this vacuum of power and uncertainty that kings like Henry VIII and later Elizabeth I would shape the future, transforming England from a kingdom scarred by civil wars into a power capable of challenging entire empires.
The end of the Civil Wars and the rise of the Tudor dynasty opened a new chapter for England. With the kingdom more stable under Henry VII and later Henry VIII, the country turned its eyes to the sea and the promises of discovery. The conflicts of medieval England were giving way to an age of exploration. Inspired by the success of Spain and Portugal, the English crown began encouraging navigators and merchants to seek wealth beyond the horizon. Thus, the seeds of the future British colonial expansion would be implanted, even if still timidly. Henry VIII, remembered for his break with the Catholic Church and the creation of the Anglican Church, also invested in naval power. His reforms allowed England to compete on equal terms with larger continental powers. The Navy, once limited in role, became central for defense and for projecting power. This advance would be fundamental for the Tudors, as it enabled the kingdom not only to resist invaders, but also to project itself beyond the island. The idea of a British Empire was still distant, but the path had already begun to be traced. At the end of the 15th century, the figure of John Cabot emerged. Financed by the crown, he explored regions in North America, claiming territories that, centuries later, would justify English colonies. Although his voyages did not have the same immediate impact as the Spanish conquests, they represented a symbolic step. It was the first sign that England did not intend to limit itself to Europe, but wished to cross the Atlantic in search of new horizons. This exploratory impulse was added to commercial ambition, linking internal survival to opportunities overseas. The reign of Elizabeth I expanded these ambitions even further. From the second half of the 16th century, England supported privateers like Francis Drake and John Hawkins, who attacked Spanish ships loaded with treasure. These acts of piracy, tolerated by the Queen, served to weaken Spain and enrich the crown. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588 consolidated England's position as a rising naval power. It was not only a military victory, but also a symbol that the kingdom could challenge greater empires and still triumph. Colonization attempts, however, were not always successful. The Roanoke colony, for example, mysteriously disappeared, becoming one of the great enigmas of English history. Even so, these failures did not discourage England. On the contrary, they served as lessons that would prepare the ground for future undertakings, such as the foundation of Jamestown at the beginning of the 17th century. Each failure was treated as experience, each attempt as another step in building an English presence in the New World. It was in this same spirit that the Puritans boarded the Mayflower in the year 1620. Seeking religious freedom, they endured storms and hunger until establishing a new colony in America. Their journey became a symbol of perseverance and faith, marking the beginning of a lasting presence of English communities on the continent. These settlers, driven by religious convictions, helped expand England's reach, consolidating the idea that overseas land would be essential for the kingdom's future. At the same time, the foundation of the East India Company in the year 1600 opened the doors for trade with Asia. Through it, England began competing for routes and precious goods, such as spices and textiles, against Portuguese and Dutch merchants. This milestone represented the start of a structured global expansion, in which not only explorers and adventurers, but also companies supported by the crown shaped the nation's destiny. The path to British colonial expansion was now officially open, and soon the Caribbean, Africa, and India would fall into English orbit.
The beginning of the 17th century marked the consolidation of the English presence in distant territories. The foundation of Jamestown in the year 1607 in Virginia represented the first permanent English colony in America.
There, settlers faced hunger, disease, and conflicts with native peoples, coming close to total collapse. But over time, the cultivation of tobacco became the economic base of the region, attracting new settlers and ensuring the survival of the settlement. This experience showed that the colonization of America, despite its challenges, could bring immense profits to the crown and to investors. Meanwhile, the Puritans reinforced the colonial advance. In the year 1620, their voyage aboard the Mayflower became a symbol of the search for religious freedom. They established the colony of Plymouth, enduring a devastating first winter. With the help of local peoples and strict discipline, they managed to survive. The story of these settlers soon became part of the English collective memory, remembered as a milestone of faith and perseverance. More than just an isolated community, the Puritans represented a cultural and religious expansion of England on American soil. The Caribbean also entered the crown's sights. During the 17th century, the colonization of the Caribbean began with the occupation of strategic islands such as Barbados and Jamaica. These regions quickly became central to sugar production, using enslaved labor brought from Africa. The triangular trade, linking Europe, Africa, and America, brought England enormous wealth at the cost of human suffering on an unimaginable scale. The English presence in the Caribbean showed how the British colonial expansion was not limited to North America, but spread across tropical seas. In the same period, the East India Company expanded the English reach in Asia. The search for spices and fine textiles led to direct confrontations with the Portuguese and the Dutch, who already dominated trade in the region. Gradually, the English secured strategic positions in India, paving the way for a much broader future domination. This presence was still in its early stages, but it showed that England, once worried only about resisting Vikings and unifying its lands, was now competing on a global scale. Expansion also involved large-scale naval conflicts. Francis Drake, who had already challenged Spain under Elizabeth I, became a symbol of English boldness at sea. His attacks on enemy fleets not only weakened rivals, but also enriched England. Each victorious battle reinforced the idea that the English Navy would be the heart of the future British Empire. The defeat of the Spanish Armada remained the reminder that even the greatest enemies could be overcome. The wealth coming from trade and colonization transformed England. Ports filled with exotic goods, and London grew as a financial and commercial center. The British Empire was not yet fully formed, but its foundations were already visible on different continents. This network of territories and trade routes gave England unprecedented power, even if accompanied by political and social tensions within the kingdom itself. This new reality, however, would not remain stable for long. If on one hand the British colonial expansion grew in strength and reach, on the other, religious tensions and internal disputes would soon begin to threaten the established order. It was precisely this scenario of prosperity and conflict that would prepare the way for figures like Oliver Cromwell and for civil wars that would shake the very crown. The prosperity brought by the British colonial expansion and the growth of trade did not prevent England from plunging into deep internal crises. During the 17th century, religious tensions intensified, clashing the Anglican Church, created by Henry VIII, with different Protestant groups, such as the Puritans. These disputes spread not only through churches, but also through Parliament and the royal court itself, creating divisions that threatened the stability achieved with such effort. It was the prelude to a new stage of wars and persecutions. The reign of Charles I became the center of this turmoil. His attempts to rule without Parliament and to impose religious uniformity heightened discontent, while the Crown sought to affirm its absolute authority. Opposing groups defended greater political and religious freedom. This clash of ideas turned into open conflict, which became known as the English Civil War.
The country, which had consolidated colonies in America and the Caribbean and opened trade routes in Asia, now turned its sword against itself. It was in this scenario that Oliver Cromwell emerged, one of the most striking figures in English history. A talented military leader and deeply religious man, Cromwell commanded the Parliamentary Army, known as the New Model Army. His troops, disciplined and driven by strong conviction, defeated the Royalist forces in decisive battles. For the first time, an English king, Charles I, would be tried and executed in the year 1649, shaking centuries of monarchical tradition. England was entering an unprecedented period, a republic led by Cromwell. Cromwell's government was marked both by moral rigidity and by military expansion. He brutally repressed revolts in Ireland and Scotland, consolidating English power in the British Isles. At the same time, he strengthened the navy and boosted England's presence on the seas, preparing the ground for future naval supremacy. His project of internal order was directly linked to the dream of colonial expansion, showing that England's destiny could not be separated from overseas dominance. Thus, between internal wars, religious persecutions, and regime changes, England continued to expand its global presence. Ships kept sailing to America, the Caribbean, and India, while London grew as an international trade center. The internal political instability contrasted with external expansion, creating a paradox. The more the kingdom fought with itself, the further it advanced toward becoming a world power. And this movement would open the way for even more intense colonial disputes yet to come. With the death of Cromwell and the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, England entered a new phase of political adjustments and colonial expansion. Although the return of kings brought some stability, religious and political tensions remained alive. Parliament, strengthened by the experience of the Civil War, was not willing to fully yield to the crown. This dispute between royal power and parliamentary power would shape the next steps of English history, at the same time that the British Empire expanded even further. During this period, the colonization of the Caribbean grew even stronger. Islands such as Jamaica and Barbados became centers of sugar production, sustained by the forced labor of enslaved Africans. The slave trade became an essential part of the English colonial economy, fueling the wealth of London and guaranteeing enormous profits for merchants and investors. The Caribbean was becoming one of the pillars of the rising British Empire, showing how economic and human exploitation were at the heart of its expansion. In North America, English colonies multiplied. Beyond Jamestown and Plymouth, new communities appeared along the Atlantic coast, attracting both adventurers and families seeking opportunities. The diversity of these colonies reflected England's multiple interests: agricultural exploitation, fur trade, religious freedom, and military strategies. Each settlement further consolidated England's presence in the New World, forming a network of territories that began to rival the Spanish and French domains. The East India Company also expanded its influence in Asia. In the 17th century, it strengthened its posts in India, established trade treaties, and in some cases fought European rivals with cannons and swords. England, which once fought for unification against the Vikings in medieval England, was now disputing trade routes and distant ports. This contrast showed how the country had transformed in just a few centuries, going from being threatened in its own territory to becoming a protagonist in the British colonial expansion. Another important element of this period was the development of the Navy. After the victory against the Spanish Armada during the reign of Elizabeth I, England continued to invest in warships and merchant vessels. Control of the seas became increasingly evident, allowing not only the defense of its routes, but also the projection of military power across different oceans. The British Navy was the guarantee that the British Empire could grow without being easily challenged. Despite colonial and commercial advances, England still faced internal divisions. Religious disputes had not disappeared, and the confrontation between Catholics and Protestants continued to influence the politics of the kingdom. Rebellions, conspiracies, and persecutions were constant, revealing that English power abroad did not eliminate conflicts at home. On the contrary, the wealth coming from the colonies often fueled disputes for control of the crown. This tension culminated in the so-called Glorious Revolution of the year 1688, when Parliament deposed James II and offered the throne to William of Orange and Mary II. This event consolidated parliamentary power and marked a definitive turning point in English politics. Meanwhile, the colonies continued to grow and a navy strengthened, preparing the way for the peak of the British colonial expansion in the following centuries. England, shaped by civil wars and religious conflicts, was now establishing itself as a global power in the making.
With the Glorious Revolution consolidating Parliament's power over the crown, England entered the 18th century with a more stable political structure, favorable to external expansion. The monarchy, now limited by laws and parliamentary oversight, could concentrate efforts on strengthening trade and the navy. This internal balance provided the foundation for the British Empire to advance in its trajectory, becoming an increasingly respected and feared power. In this context, the East India Company reached an even greater prominence. It was not just a trading company, but an arm of the English state itself. Its ships, soldiers, and administrators came to dominate strategic regions of India, interfering in local disputes and establishing a system of control that went far beyond commerce. England, which centuries earlier had fought against the Vikings and sought unification, was now dictating the rules in distant ports of the Indian Ocean. The Caribbean continued to generate enormous profits. Sugar plantations thrived, sustained by the exploitation of enslaved Africans. Ships loaded with goods departed for London, supplying European markets and enriching merchants and aristocrats. This cycle of production and exploitation made the Caribbean colonies fundamental to the British economy. The slave trade, as cruel and inhumane as it was rooted in the English colonial machine, sustaining the balance of power of the British Empire. In North America, the English colonies grew in number and population. Philadelphia, Boston, and New York began to stand out as centers of commerce and culture. The diversity of settlers, Puritans, farmers, merchants, and artisans created dynamic societies increasingly connected to Atlantic trade. Although still subordinate to the crown, these communities were already developing a certain autonomy, foreshadowing future conflicts with the metropolis. The colonization of America was becoming a vital part of British identity. Meanwhile, the seas were dominated by the English Navy. England waged wars against powers such as France and Spain, disputing colonial territories and trade routes. Each naval victory increased confidence in the country's imperial destiny. Enemies saw British ships not only as instruments of war, but as symbols of a nation building its power on maritime dominance. Triumph at sea consolidated the idea that the British Empire had no borders. Internally, London flourished as one of the greatest commercial centers in the world. Goods from India, America, and the Caribbean filled the markets and financed urban growth. The English capital also became a cultural hub with theaters, coffee houses, and academies where Enlightenment ideas circulated. This intellectual environment, combined with wealth from the colonies, reinforced the image of a modern and influential England. However, this prosperity came at a cost. Dependence on slavery, colonial exploitation, and constant conflicts with other powers created tensions that at some point would demand a price. Expansion seemed limitless, but the British Empire would still face challenges that tested its strength and cohesion. The 18th century promised glory, but also increasingly devastating wars.
The 18th century advanced, and with it, grew to colonial disputes among the European powers. England found itself constantly at war with France, both on the European continent and in overseas territories. These conflicts became known as the Anglo-French Wars, a series of confrontations that crossed the Atlantic and reached India. Each victory or defeat was not only military, but also defined control over trade routes and strategic regions. The British Empire grew stronger with every battle, consolidating its maritime dominance. One of the most remarkable episodes was the 7 Years' War, which began in the year 1756. This global conflict involved Europe, America, Africa, and Asia, and is considered by many to be the first war of worldwide reach. England and France clashed on every continent, and English naval supremacy proved decisive. The British victory meant the expansion of its colonial territories, especially in North America and India, where French dominance was drastically reduced. In North America, England expanded its presence after defeating France and Canada. Strategic cities such as Quebec and Montreal passed into British control, reinforcing England's position on the continent. However, this expansion also brought tensions with the local colonists. The increase of taxes and trade restrictions imposed by the Crown to sustain the wars created constant discontent among the colonists, building an environment that would later explode into the independence of the 13 colonies. In India, the East India Company consolidated its power after defeating the French in decisive battles such as Plassey in the year 1757. Under the leadership of figures like Robert Clive, the British began to control vast Indian regions, establishing agreements with local leaders and imposing their political and military influence. India, which until then had been a space of commercial dispute, was beginning to transform into a central part of the British imperial project. The Caribbean, in turn, continued to be the stage for naval battles and colonial disputes. Productive islands such as Grenada and Dominica changed hands between the English and the French, reflecting the intensity of European competition. However, British naval power often prevailed, ensuring the continuous flow of sugar, rum, and enslaved Africans to supply the imperial economy. The region remained essential for the wealth of the crown and for the strengthening of the Atlantic trade. Amid so many victories, the British Navy established itself as the most powerful in the world. Well-armed ships, experienced commanders, and bold strategies allowed England to dominate the seas. This naval dominance was the true foundation of the British Empire, ensuring the transport of goods, the defense of colonies, and the projection of global power. Without the Navy, the entire imperial structure would have been impossible to sustain. Despite triumphs in the wars, England was not free of problems. The high costs of the conflicts generated enormous debts, and the need to levy taxes in the colonies created constant friction. The same war that consolidated the British Empire also sowed the revolts that would soon challenge its authority. On the horizon, the beginning of the crisis with the 13 American colonies was already taking shape, testing in an unprecedented way London's ability to keep its vast empire united.
The end of the 7 Years' War brought England vast territory, but also a gigantic debt. To balance the accounts, the Crown imposed new taxes on the American colonies, such as the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. These measures were seen by the colonists as abusive, since they had no representation in the British Parliament. The slogan, "No taxation without representation," echoed through the streets of the 13 colonies, paving a way for an unprecedented revolt against the British Empire. The protests began small, but soon turned into organized movements. Resistance to the taxes led to remarkable episodes such as the Boston Tea Party in the year 1773, when colonists threw shipments of British tea into the sea as a sign of protest. The repression by the Crown only increased indignation, uniting the colonies against the metropolis. What at first seemed like merely a tax dispute became the spark of a revolutionary process. The American War of Independence began in the year 1775, pitting the colonial army against British troops. Despite England's military superiority, the colonists counted on the support of France and other powers hostile to the British Empire. Battles spread throughout the 13 colonies, and the struggle for independence turned into a prolonged war, exhausting both sides. The British defeat at Yorktown in the year 1781 sealed the fate of the war. The Treaty of Paris, signed in the year 1783, officially recognized the independence of the United States. For England, the loss of the 13 colonies was a heavy blow, shaking the image of invincibility built during the 18th century. Even so, the British Empire was not in decline. On the contrary, it turned its attention to other regions, reinforcing its presence in India, the Caribbean, and Africa. While losing territories in North America, England strengthened its position in the East. The East India Company expanded its control in India, increasing territories under British domination and boosting the flow of wealth to London. This process marked the transition from limited colonization to true imperial rule in the Indian subcontinent, which would become the heart of the British Empire in the centuries to come. In the Caribbean, the sugar and slave trade remained highly profitable. Even with revolts by enslaved people and attacks from European rivals, the region remained one of the economic pillars of the British Crown. The Atlantic continued to be the stage for a trade network linking Europe, Africa, and America, providing the British Empire with the resources needed to maintain its navy and its wars. Thus, the 18th century ended in a paradox for England. On one hand, it had lost the American colonies, but on the other, it had consolidated an even stronger imperial base in other parts of the world. The British Empire learned to reorganize itself in the face of defeats, using them as momentum to expand its influence in new directions. What seemed like an irreparable loss was in fact a prelude to a new cycle of global domination. The 19th century marked the peak of the British colonial expansion. England, already consolidated as a maritime and commercial power, extended its dominance to territories in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. The Industrial Revolution provided not only wealth, but also the need for new markets and raw materials, driving the search for colonies. The British Empire became a gigantic network of interconnected territories, sustained by its navy and by unprecedented global trade. In India, English rule ceased to be merely commercial and became political and administrative. The East India Company came to govern vast regions, imposing laws, collecting taxes, and controlling local armies. Rebellions, such as the Sepoy Rebellion in the year 1857, revealed resistance to British power, but also reinforced England's determination to consolidate its empire. India came to be considered the jewel of the crown, the ultimate symbol of the greatness of the British Empire. In Africa, the 19th century was marked by a frantic race for territories. England established colonies and protectorates in strategic regions such as Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria. Control of the trade routes, such as the Suez Canal, reinforced British supremacy at sea. The exploitation of natural resources and the imposition of artificial borders shaped the destiny of the African continent, leaving deep marks that echo to this day. Oceania also entered the British orbit. The colonization of Australia began as a destination for prisoners, but quickly expanded into agricultural and commercial colonies. New Zealand followed a similar path, becoming part of the imperial network. These distant territories, though geographically isolated, reinforced the image that the British Empire had no limits, reaching the ends of the world. At the same time, the Caribbean and the Americas still played important roles. Even after the independence of the 13 colonies, other possessions remained under British rule, such as Jamaica and Barbados. The trade of sugar, rum, and other products continued to enrich the metropolis, although it no longer carried the same weight as in previous centuries. England had learned to reorganize its colonial priorities, maintaining the balance of its vast empire. Internally, London was transforming into a world metropolis. The wealth from the colonies financed urban works, universities, museums, and an intense cultural life. British power was not only military or economic, but also cultural, with the spread of the English language and values that reached across the globe. The British Empire dictated fashions, politics, and trade standards, consolidating itself as the greatest global power of the 19th century. However, behind this grandeur, the first signs of wear began to appear. Colonial revolts, pressures for independence, and rivalries with other European powers began to indicate that the empire would not be eternal. The same expansion that projected strength also generated internal and external tensions. The 19th century was the high point of the British Empire, but at the same time, the slow beginning of challenges that, in the future, would change the destiny of this world power.
The trajectory of the British Empire shows how a kingdom that was born amid Viking invasions and the struggle of Alfred the Great in medieval England transformed into the power that shaped the modern world. Centuries of the unification of England, wars such as the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, religious transformations under Henry VIII and the creation of the Anglican Church, the reign of Elizabeth I and the victory against the Spanish Armada, the piracy of Francis Drake, and the first colonies like Jamestown and the Mayflower with the Puritans. Then came the East India Company, the colonization of the Caribbean, and the British colonial expansion, which carried England to every continent. Each conquest came at the cost of blood, exploitation, and a resistance, but together they built an empire without precedent. If you enjoyed this dive into history, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to keep following along.